Thanks for downloading the Marcus Pye podcast.
Welcome to the Marcus Pye podcast on historicracingnews.com. Today we talk about Spa-Francorchamps, Laguna Seca and, by way of contrast, Castle Combe. We'll be talking here in the studio and also bringing you interviews with all sorts of people involved with historic racing. I'm joined by Paul Tarsi, and to be honest, it's a bit of a privilege to have you here in the UK, Paul. I mean, normally up in the air, but what have you been doing in the last couple of weeks?
Well, not too much up in the air, actually, Marcus. It's been rather other than that. I mean, yes, we'll talk about Laguna Seca a bit later on, but I've actually been sort of whizzing backwards and forwards for all sorts of reasons, from Brands Hatch through to Silverstone and back. And that I think one of the things that has come to my mind is just how different those two circuits now are. Absolutely right.
You've got on one hand the home of British motor racing, the other the circuit of the champions, as it was once branded, and they are very, very different in every respect. I first went to Silverstone in 1958, and I remember vividly going to Brands in the early 60s to watch my godfather sprint an NSU Prince 4. Could you imagine? You could have out-sprinted an NSU Prince 4 on foot, one would have thought. But absolutely, both take me back to my early days of attending motorsport events.
It's funny because you say that, and yes, I probably did many of the same sorts of things, and that Brands was always my spiritual home. I never really tuned in to Silverstone in quite the same way, even as a kid.
It's funny, I'd moved from South London to Hampshire by the time I really got into going to racing a bit more regularly, a bit more seriously. So I recall going to the International Trophy and the British Grand Prix in the kind of later 60s, usually strapped into the passenger seat of the Rochdale Olympic that the aforementioned NSU sprinting godfather and my father shared. But yes, I vividly recall going to watch Jim Clark win the 67 British Grand Prix at Silverstone when you could see at least a third of the circuit from any one vantage point. Equally, I remember going back to Brands for things like the fabled Boxing Day race meeting that always used to happen, when guys used to come out and try and enter every race on the programme, or it seemed that way, a bit like historic racing today, actually.
For some people. Yeah, I'd forgotten the Boxing Day Brands thing, because that was literally on Boxing Day, wasn't it?
Absolutely, and these days you have a race meeting at Mallory Park on Boxing Day, don't you? The Plum Pudding race meeting, which has a really good local following, and it combines cars and bikes.
I can remember going to the Boxing Day Brands thing, and that the announcement came out over the tannoy that there was a non-starter in the Formula Ford race, who was Roy John James, who will not be starting, although he's entered because he's been arrested for the Great Train Robbery.
That's right. Well, Roy James came back to racing later on. He did a little bit of Formula Ford and a bit of Formula Atlantic as well. And he had quite a big accident, broke his leg at one point, and that kind of, I think, dampened his ardour at that point. But you say he was away for a while. But he was a friend of the Formula One Supremo, wasn't he? And he was a very gifted silversmith, and he crafted quite a famous trophy that was awarded in racing for years to come.
Which takes us down another path, which we're probably not going to go down. But yes, I think it's interesting just to see those differences. I think Silverstone is very corporate now. Strangely, one of the events that I was at was on what I think they now call the National Circuit, which uses the old pits and
the heritage pits, as they're known.
Oh, are they heritage pits?
Oh, yes. When you come to Silverstone Classic, they are the heritage pits. Yeah.
Wow, and it's that bit of the circuit kind of has the original feel to it, I think.
Yes, it does. I mean, you're further back from where you used to be. And of course, I remember vividly the 1973 British Grand Prix meeting there, and that incident triggered by Jody Scheckter when half the field was decimated. But in those days, you could stand on top of the pits. There was a viewing gallery there. I was on the outside, having been the recipient with Dad of a pair of tickets from his boss, who always used to book tickets for the Grand Prix, but rarely could get round to going. So no argument there. Yeah, it's absolutely brilliant. So we sat in the grandstand as most of Team Surtees arrived at our feet.
Yeah, well, I was on top of the pits that day, and yes, I remember it only too well. And it's sometimes you see those sorts of accidents, and it's almost the slow motion thing. And people always talk about the slow motion thing, but I can remember Scheckter getting on the grass in that McLaren M23, and he was very much the hot shoe, wasn't he?
He was absolutely.
He was driving a third car, which is I think something I'd love to see in Formula One now. But he's driving a third McLaren, and he just put two wheels on the grass on the outside of Woodcut, which of course then was desperately quick. And I thought, oh, that could be nasty. And then it went round. I thought, oh, it is nasty. And then, of course, the whole thing, and he collected 2/3 of the field.
It escalated, yeah, absolutely. And wasn't the race won by Peter Revson, his teammate?
It was, yeah.
And he didn't have too much opposition, but Peter was a great driver.
Yeah.
And it was just super to see somebody different end up winning a race.
And isn't it strange to think now in these really commercial days that Peter Revson was heir to the Revlon cosmetics company, and yet he was driving a Yardley McLaren, which I think is, it just wouldn't happen.
It's no stranger than a Sunbeam Tiger being powered by a Ford engine at the time when Chrysler took over Sunbeam.
Yes, that's sadly what killed it, of course, wasn't it? And there's been some great Ford engined motor cars ever since, and you had some of that, I think, at Spa, didn't you?
Very much so. The annual Spa 6 Hours that's been going since 1993 is a staple for me. I first went in 1997 when I competed driving a 26R spec Lotus Elan and a 23B sports car. So quite greedily I was in two cars, but these days it seems to be quite a regular occurrence. No, that set the seed going for me. I've been going to Spa since the mid-80s reporting, and I just loved every second of it. It was torrential rain that particular year, 97. We got both cars to the end and pretty much undamaged, which was a result.
Wow.
And then just climbed into a beaten up old VW Passat and drove back to London. I thought nothing much of it, but I've not missed one since. And for me, it's the epitome of historic racing. It's the best endurance race in the world for historic cars. They're pre-66 cars, essentially, but the Ford GT40s that have now won 14 of the 27 are largely built last Thursday. But they're built to an FIA spec pattern, the Appendix K rules, and they're accepted on that front. But this year was a wet one again. We've not had a really wet one for 3 years, I think it is now. But we had, I think, 14 GT40s started, but they finished 1, 3, and 5. But it was a very, very different type of race. And, for that reason alone, it was a safe race. It was a clean race. There were a few little safety car interventions, but of course you're going to find that because it races into darkness. And this year there was a wonderful novelty. It started at 3:55, which was when it was supposed to start, so it ran the full 6 hours. And that, of course, mucked up quite a few fuel calculations for a lot of the teams. You think, well, we were racing for 5 hours and 19 minutes, so we'll fuel accordingly.
Oh, right.
Which was very, very interesting. But on this occasion, it was a super race, and you had Jim Farley, who's one of the big cheeses at the Ford Motor Company, started from pole in a GT40, having been put there by Eric van der Poel, the former Belgian Formula One driver. And as I've remarked in print, to be sitting on pole in a 99 car field, looking downhill towards Eau Rouge and Radillon, with drizzle about to fall, and you're a very, very competent driver, but you're not a pro like quite a few of the guys around you. No pressure then. But it all panned out really, really nicely. It ended up being won by Gordon Shedden and Philip Walker and Miles Griffiths in Philip's GT40. But they had a really great trouble-free run. Very good tactic. The owner drove for a very short session, second, then put Miles in and Gordon back to finish. But second was the Aston Martin Project 214 clone of Wolfgang Friedrichs, which was started by Michael Mallock and finished by Simon Hadfield. He's the winningest driver in that Spa 6 Hour history with 5 wins. And they finished second overall, won the GTS 12 section because the really quick Jags fell by the wayside. Poor old John Clark, the Scottish motor baron, he said to me on the grid that his tactic this year was to keep out of trouble. Within 5 or 6 laps, he'd had an incident at Le Combe and was out of the race. And then John Minshaw and Gary Pearson took up the cudgels, and they were charging along, doing a brilliant job in John's E-Type when the engine rodded itself without any warning, and that was that out. But the long and short of it was that we ended up with the Aston second, with another GT40 driven by Britain's Sam Hancock and a German guy called Nikolaus Ditting, who'd not done the race previously. They finished third, which was a great achievement. But the Hancock family had a real field day because Anthony, the father, who I first knew when he was racing Formula 4, had a Delta Formula 4 car back in, I think, 1980. He ran a restaurant chain back then. Now has a really nice gastropub chain based in Surrey, and he ended up again doing the race for the first time with younger son Ollie and with Joe Twyman. And they finished fourth in a Lotus Elan, which was just brilliant.
They have no right to do that. Though,
well, I mean, they had another wonderfully trouble-free run, a great car prepared by Tom Ebbs, and it ran beautifully. But down the order, there's all sorts of nuances. There's some great stories there. Overnight engine changes, overnight gearbox changes. Somebody changed a gearbox in the race and just sort of got their car going again towards the end because they'd paid the entry fee, and why not? The mechanics were there, give them a little bit of exercise. But that was good. But one of the most remarkable stories was the 3 guys who turned up with their Mini Countryman, the car that was built for Goodwood at the start of the year. Mark Burnett from the SU Carburetor Company, Nick Swift, the engine tuning guru, and Endef Owens, former national Mini 7 champion, who'd built the car. And while they were not eligible to compete, the car didn't have an HTP paper, and there were 1 or 2 other technicalities that meant that it was there as an invitee only. They finished 23rd overall. I think it was 10 laps behind the winning GT40 in a Mini Countryman.
In a 6 hour race.
Yeah, of course, Mini Countrymans have a history in contemporary racing because John Ailey, the Ailey bars, the roll cage man, he took a racing Mini to the Nürburgring back in the early 60s, and it broke in practice. So they used their Mini Countryman road car in the race instead. I'm not quite sure whether they put the race engine into that or what part of the race car broke. But again, it was a historic precedent.
And it's lovely how these things go around in circles because John Ailey's co-driver, I think at that time, and certainly at Le Mans with the Mini Marcos, was a chap called Tim Lalonde,
right?
Who was a friend of my dad's.
Okay.
And I can remember being dragged off to a meetings. I don't know why my dad had taken me to a trade meeting, but he and Tim Lalonde were in the same sort of business, and I was dragged along as probably a 12-year-old, something like that. And ended up spending the whole evening sitting in the bar talking to Tim Lalonde about driving a Mini Marcos at Le Mans, which was amazing. Quite something.
It's just so funny. I mean, you talked about that. My father was invited by Tarmac, the road construction people, to go to a race meeting at Brands Hatch in 1971, September 71, 26th, I think it was. And it was the final round of the European Formula 5000 Championship, sponsored by Rothmans. Absolutely wonderful. I would have been, 13 just. And I was sort of put into bat as the guide for my father's group of people, take them around the paddock and show them what was what, which was absolutely brilliant. So walking through the old market stalls that used to be in the sloping paddock at Brands. You didn't have race cars kind of behind the pits as you do now. And it was just brilliant, and had a just wonderful time. And I just remember not only the Formula 5000s, and that race was won by Brian Redman, who's one of my all-time heroes. He was driving the Castrol Sid Taylor McLaren M18, not a good car by any stretch of the imagination, but he beat Frank Gardner, who was by that stage in the sort of the rather space-aged Lola T300, that was essentially a T240 Formula 2 car with a Chevy 5-litre engine nailed to his shoulders, and probably not much more than that. But it was just brilliant. And among the people in that race was Terry Sanger with the Harrier, which was about the size of an aircraft carrier. And we had a Terry Sanger memorial meeting at a race at Castle Combe, or a trophy presented on Saturday at the Autumn Classic. So there's some amazing parallels to be drawn with these things.
Isn't it strange? I haven't thought about Terry Sanger for decades, but he epitomised everything that was good about that sort of. He was a brave amateur without any doubt, but he was on the cusp of racing with people like Brian Redman and Peter Gethin, and he was never going to beat them. But he was out there and he had a great time.
But he was there doing it. He was an ex-motorcycle racer. He was an absolutely brilliant young engineer, and he did a lot of his training at Bristol, and the Aero Engines division. And he was just incredibly clever. And I saw him when I was first at Castle Combe in '67. He was competing then. He had that V8 Cortina. And later he had the Formula 5000 cars, the T300 Lola, of which he managed to bisect at Mallory Park, coming out of the Devil's Elbow. But later saw him in Chevrolet Camaros and things like that. And just a really, really good guy. And there's a superb little book which Ken Davis, who's chairman of the Castle Combe Racing Club, wrote as a kind of a friend of his and a fan, clearly, over the years. And it came out a year or so ago, and it's a really, really interesting read. More of a social history than a kind of blow-by-blow, then I raced here, then I raced there. But it's full of intrigue, it's full of personality. And what I love about it, it's not just a kind of a profile with a sad ending like so many biographies tend to be, but what it is, it's something that really gets under the skin of the guy, and you feel at the end of the book that you knew him. I didn't know him. I spoke to him a couple of times, once in person, once over the phone, but I really got a great insight into an old school racer.
It's interesting you should say that, because I've recently just finished reading Howden Ganley's book, The Road to Monaco.
It's a cracker.
But that was exactly my thought at the end of that book, that I thought, I know the man. That it wasn't, probably the title of the book's a bit of a misnomer, because it's not about, and then we went to Monaco.
No, but it traces his way from back home in Hamilton, New Zealand, and sort of setting out in racing as a young journalist, driving a Lotus 11. And the whole thing is fascinating. Some of the parts of that story are really very, very interesting. It's a wonderful book. It's one of my favourite racing books, in actual fact. The other one being the Dr. Tony Goodwin autobiography, which is magnificent. Doctor on the Grid, absolutely superb, and it tells a story of how a young trainee doctor, who then of course became qualified as a doctor, and father of Chris Goodwin, of course, of Aston Martin these days, went off and raced all round the world. But often he would pack up in his medical practice on a sort of a Friday afternoon, drive to the Nürburgring with some heap of tat on the trailer, compete, get his start money, manage to scrape his way back across the channel on a Sunday night, and be back there in his white coat, sitting in the office at 9 o'clock in the morning when the first patient rattled in.
It's a different time, and I don't think either of us would want to sit here and say, it's not like it used to be, and the old times were better, because clearly some of them were and some of them weren't.
The old times were different.
They were different.
They were a damn sight more dangerous.
Yeah.
The cars were a lot more rudimentary. But at the end of the day, it was what it was at the time. And I think that's a phrase that sort of echoes throughout the world now. Historic racing is still very spectacular. Club racing is still great in some areas. But there's, like all these things, there's the good, there's the indifferent, and there's the really great that shines above it. And that Spa meeting, for me, is brilliant, because you see not only the 6 hours, you see historic Formula One cars, 3-litre DFV cars, you see the historic Grand Prix Cars Association racers come out in cars from the sort of, sometimes from as far back as the 1920s right through to 1965. And on this occasion, the very, very wet race, we had front-engine cars dominating, essentially, the second one. And Rod Jolly in the Lister Jaguar Monzanapolis car ended up ahead of Andy Middlehurst in the Jim Clark Lotus 25 V8, pursued by 2 Maserati 250Fs, one original, and a Lotus 16. And it was just magnificent. And some of the other races, including the pre-war race, Motor Racing Legends pre-war race, which was again sensational. And the star of that, in terms of managing to win the race, was Dr. Robin Tului, former astrophysicist and Formula One design, research and development guru, with Renault and Mercedes. He's been with Bentley and Ducati in latter years. But when you look at the car he built, which was based on an ancient Riley chassis from the 20s with a American Manasco aero engine in it, it was brilliant. But for me, to see the Morgan Aero 3-wheeler come through to third place overall and set the quickest velocity up the Kemmel Straight with Ewan Cameron and Sue Derbyshire driving, it was just something extraordinary. And that's the daring do of some of these people really is amazing to me.
I think that the daring do is it, because I find that those cars, those races, appeal to me more and more now than they ever did, maybe even 10 years ago.
I think it's the miscellany in there, and when you're kind of close to the sport as we are, when you actually see it firsthand how difficult it is to kind of keep these cars going, keep them alive, keep the parts in operational order, and if they break, as often as not, you've got to go and make another one. Reverse engineering is much easier these days than it used to be. Or easier, it's technically easier, but probably more expensive.
Probably,
but at the end of the day, you end up probably with a better product that looks like the one that came off it.
We had a fantastic conversation when Nick and I were at the Hampton Court Concours of Elegance, and it's not a racing car, but it's a Rolls-Royce Silver Ghost, and you can see all about it on our YouTube channel, on the historicracingnews.com YouTube channel. But this was a guy who bought this car, which had a pickup truck body on it when he bought it, and it turned out to be a Maharaja's Silver Ghost, and that he has rebuilt it exactly as it would have been, including the 4 Purdy shotguns sitting on the running boards, and it's beautiful. But I said to him, "Where do you get the bits?" And he said to me, "It's amazing what you can pick up at the odd auto jumble." And I thought, how on earth do you go to an auto jumble and find something for a Rolls-Royce Silver Ghost?
Just amazing, isn't it? But you look around and you always see something of interest. But you see transformations of cars amazes me. You look at that 555 Super Squalo Ferrari Grand Prix car that was really not a very successful car in the 1950s. But one of those went down to New Zealand, and ended up being the engine was taken out of it, put into a Morris Minor, a thing called the Morari, and there's all sorts of ways to recycle not very good racing cars. But of course, by the time that people realise that they're hugely significant historically and the values are starting to escalate, they soon find their way back to their original spec.
Well, I think that's probably why you don't see many super saloons about now, isn't it? Those cars that were created out of Lola 2-litre sports cars and
Chevrons
Formula
and things.
5000 cars.
Absolutely. One of my favourite eras of the sport. I could battle on for hours about super saloons, and maybe that's another occasion. But those cars, of course, people soon realised if you're running a Chevrolet V8 engined super saloon based on Formula 5000 or Lola T70 corners and the likes of Mick Hill with his Capris, certainly John Turner from Dorset with his Skoda coupe, things like that, then you could do it and pick up a couple of £100 from Tricentral or something for your efforts. Or for the same running cost, you could have actually disposed of all the sort of the tin top stuff, gone back to running a Formula 5000 and going out there and winning £1,000, whatever, with something you didn't have to convert. And both Mick Hill and John Turner ended up doing Formula 5000 with a March 74 and a Lola T330 respectively. And that Lola is with a friend in Oz, who still competes with it, which is just brilliant. So, Paul, while bolstering your frequent flyer points tally, which is quite impressive, I should imagine, you went to Laguna Seca and you caught up with Bill Warner.
I did. I mean, I love Laguna Seca. I can say that now because I've been once, but it was absolutely fabulous. Bill is a long-term friend of historicracingnews.com and the founder of the Amelia Island Concours d'Elegance, and that he lives, eats and breathes historic race cars. He was sitting there next to his ex Bob Tullia's TR8, and that it was great to catch him. So, Bill Warner here at Laguna Seca in the blaring sun, but you're telling me all about the plans that you have for next year at Amelia Island.
Oh yeah, Paul, we'll be honoring Roger Penske. We'll have in excess of 30 cars, from cars he drove to Team Penske cars to the Indy winners with the Borg Warner Trophy. We're going to be doing cars of Scaglietti. We're going to be doing Porsche first, the first win at Le Mans, first win at Sebring, first win at Targa Florio. The cars of Harley Earl with the prototypes from General Motors. And we're going to have all the mid-engine Corvette prototypes from GM, from Serve 1 on up to Indy. And we're going to have a big surprise. We're going to have Corvette GS2, which has never been seen. It was a Frank Winchell project car in 1963 that Jim Hall developed.
Well, that's not bad, is it?
It's a start.
Now, obviously, with Roger Penske, he's had such a long life in motorsport, both as a driver and as an entrant. It must be really hard to know where to start and stop.
Well, it is. I mean, we had to look at what was available. For example, his Xerox Special, the first car, which was based on the Cooper Formula One car. There's a lot of controversy around it. There's one car that has pieces of it. The other car is in Venezuela, and that situation down there is such that it's disappeared. The Cooper Monaco is in the UK in pieces, but we're getting Porsche RS Spyder and the Grand Sport Corvette and the Chaparral 2C, and we're working on some RS60s and RSKs, you know, cars that he drove. Then the cars at Team Penske, we're going to have all 5 of the Sunoco Camaros. We're going to crank them up and bring them up front by your stand to drown out your microphone.
Oh, good.
We'll have the 91730, 91710, 2 Lola T70s, the Can-Am car and the Daytona winner, and a bunch of other fillers, as Bobby Hunt would say, field fillers, you know.
But fillers in any other world is
fillers.
Not,
I mean,
is not
first-ranked fillers that win races.
Yeah. Fillers with almost perfect races.
Yeah, you got it.
And Amelia is a huge charity event, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. We're a 501c3, and we give to Community Hospice, Navy Marine Corps Relief Fund, Spina Bifida for crippled children and adults, and for the Shop with Cops program for underprivileged children of Fernandina Beach in Nassau County.
That's absolutely tremendous. The other thing I think that we ought to talk about is the fact that we have today signed the deal that we will be covering the whole of Amelia Island on the live stream.
And we really pleased with that, and that, you know, people who can't make it can see everything on your feed on the internet. So that's exciting.
So to this weekend and this lovely TRH, you've had this a while.
I've had this about 25 years. It's one of two built by Group 44. Has about 380 horsepower, weighs about 2,300 pounds. I'm at the back of the pack. I have the best seat to watch the race. And after about 5 laps, I'm living in the rearview mirror.
But you're having a ball nonetheless.
You know, for my age, what the heck? Red Bull's not going to be hiring me anytime soon.
Oh, I don't know.
No, I don't think so, Paul.
I think you and me would make a great team for
I
Red
think
Bull.
so. I don't know on what, but it would be a good team.
Well, it'll keep us alive anyway.
Maybe we could get the AARP to underwrite us and something.
Bill Warner, it's always a joy to talk to you. Thank you so much.
Thanks,
and,
Paul.
We'll look forward
Good
to
to
seeing
see
you soon. Thank you.
My best. Thank you.
Well, Bill sounds like a really cool guy, and that Amelia Island Concours in Florida, the Racers Concours as it's known, is already on the agenda for next year. I can confirm that historicracingnews.com will be providing live stream video coverage for the event next season.
And we're really looking forward to that. I mean, as you say, the Racers Concours, it's themed very much around those whole things. Certainly when I was there a couple of years ago, and they had a feature on North American Racing Team, NART, and that there was just this, I'm not sure whether the collective noun for Ferraris is a phalanx, but and I stood there between two cars on the 18th fairway at the Amelia Island Golf Club, and reached out and put a hand on two Ferraris, both of which were Le Mans winners.
At which point someone came rushing across with a cloth and polished your prints out, no doubt.
I know that you have a different view on the Concours from me, Marcus, but no, it wasn't like that. I mean, it's certainly some of the cars are. Certainly some of the cars are Concours queens, and that they probably don't go very far except on and off a trailer. Others do. Certainly with Amelia and with probably most of them, they tend to have a tour over the couple of days beforehand where they'll go out and just get out and wander around, and that's quite something in itself, that you can see a tour of Rolls Royces or a tour of Ferraris or whatever.
I think that's really great news, because for me, having been brought up around the racing world and the tracks, etc., I've been around innumerable museums, etc., and I love them. They're fantastic. I'd love to go to the Indianapolis Museum. That really would be on my bucket list. However, for me, a car sitting sort of dormant in a museum is sometimes a sad car, and I want to see cars that have been designed for their dynamics to be used and to be enjoyed.
You and I have had many opportunities to sit down, normally over either a cup of tea or a pint, and talking about that sort of authenticity in the museum versus the race car, and I really don't know where I sit, because I love the idea of being able to look at a car, even in a museum, and to say, yeah, that's where Mike Hawthorne sat, or that's where Tazio Nuvolari sat. And whilst it hasn't probably moved in 30 years, that's real. And then you've got the other side of it, and you said about GT40s at Spa, which maybe were built last Thursday. I'd love seeing a GT40 at Spa. But
who doesn't? I mean, at Spa last weekend, Jackie Ickx was there, and he was celebrating 60 years since he and Jackie Oliver won the last Le Mans for a Ford GT40. And there were something like 72 GT40s did a couple of laps cavalcade, but they formed them up in echelon alongside the Formula One pit wall. Sadly, not the lovely downhill start to Eau Rouge, but Jackie Ickx himself gave a talk beforehand. He dropped the flag to start the run round the circuit. His daughter Vanina was there as well, talking about the cars, etc. And it was brilliant because you saw Mark 1s and road versions with the long tails, etc. You saw some of the 7-litre bodied cars as well. There were 1 or 2 originals, but the vast majority of them were different kinds of evocations. But you could see that the owners were getting really involved in the whole thing and just loved their weekend at Francorchamps. It's
strange, isn't it, that to me, Jackie Ickx has got to be one of the coolest men in the world in every sense. And we've interviewed him a couple of times on historicracingnews.com, and that he's got these great stories, this wealth of stories, that when we talked to him, he explained about the fact that he never wanted to be a racing driver. He wanted to be a gardener. And
that's fantastic.
But for a puff of wind, then we could have been robbed of Jackie Ickx, one of the greatest racing drivers of all time, because he'd be out there tending people's roses. It
could have been Alan Titchmarsh.
What a thought!
As opposed to Ian, the great commentator.
As opposed to Ian Titchmarsh, the whole thing that goes on with that. I mean, one of the other things that we did was just not only talk to Bill Warner at Laguna Seca, but just have a great walk round, and that was good.
Well, there's so much to see at those type of events, and I know that modern race driver Jordan Taylor was all togged up in his latest fireproofs, etc. But he wasn't driving a modern prototype, whatever. He was out there in one of the most iconic Chevrolet Corvettes of all time, one of the John Greenwood cars, the real Batmobiles.
Well, the suit is correct. A lot different, isn't it? Yeah. Jordan Taylor, he's getting to ride in John Greenwood's Corvette that is a legendary and very iconic automobile. You having fun?
Yeah, it's probably one of the coolest race cars I've ever driven. Obviously, growing up in the 2000s, there's a lot of technology, and all the cars are, somewhat similar. And you look at the cars in the 70s or 80s even, or 90s, and in one class, the cars can be so different. So for me, driving this car, like you said, so iconic, being a Corvette driver in the past, to understand the history of this car, being, John Greenwood carrying the Corvette brand through the 70s, to be able to drive one of his cars is super special, and at a place like the Reunion is awesome.
Now, you came up in the sport, as you said, when the cars are a lot different than what these cars are like. What has it been like for you to get to drive something that doesn't have all the technology, let's say?
Yeah, for me, it's so cool. I mean, it's just a pure race car. It's just raw. Everything that you feel through the car is what it's telling you. There's a 4-speed manual transmission, 800 horsepower. The brakes aren't very good. It doesn't handle very well. So the driver really has to get the most out of it. And back then, there's no data, there's no overlays to understand where you're losing time. So it's up to the driver to really understand how to maximize the car. And for me, it's just pure joy.
Well, we're gonna. There we go. Well,
probably gonna fire back up. Oh,
he's gonna fire back up.
No.
That was pure power we were hearing there. That's the sister car to this Greenwood Corvette that you hear coming in next to us. You'll see that come in behind us here. So, you've driven this place in a lot of different things. You've driven the Corvette. You've driven the Cadillac. What's this like to handle on a racetrack like this?
It's a monster. The how we call it the hairpin at the end of the straight, turn 2, and turn 1's the kink on the straight.
Yeah.
Usually that's not a corner for us, but in this car it's a corner.
Wow.
And it's barely flat and forth. You're kind of sliding all the way through that kink into the brake zone, and you're braking as soon as you straighten up. So it's an absolute monster. I was having trouble getting second gear. It's only a 4-speed, and I was able to run just third and fourth. And I don't know what other car on the planet you could run this track in 2 gears. It's got so much power, so much torque that it can handle it in just third, and it lights up the tires in third gear, out of pretty much every single corner. So it's so much fun to drive, and it's a true honor.
Do you enjoy sliding the car, which is not something you get to do in a modern day race car?
Yeah, I mean, my first couple years in GT racing in Grand Am and IMSA was without traction control, so I was able to slide back then, and now we have traction control. We've got lots of downforce. The tires are really, really good. So the driver, you lose that skill set, I guess, and that that feeling of the car that it gives you and the pure driving that you feel in these race cars. So for me, I'm absolutely loving every lap. Like, I got out after this race, and I don't care where we finished or how fast we were, but it was so much fun just to drive. I would love to just take it out for an entire day and just do laps in it because it's that much fun.
Well, enjoy the rest of the weekend.
Yeah, thank you, I will.
Well, that was our own Jim Roller with Jordan Taylor at Laguna Seca. And we've been to California, we've been to Belgium, and finally this week we've got the opportunity to review the Castle Combe Autumn Classic. It's a great event. It's been going for 7 years now as a standalone. It was run briefly as a sort of a 3-race event in 2012 at the Grand Finals as well. But it just gets better and better and better. More people turn out in period clothing, dressed in the 50s and 60s style we associate really with Goodwood these days. But the racing was good. And there were a couple of absolutely mega races. Have you been to that event, Paul?
I've never been. No, I've been to Castle Combe a few times, and it's strange, isn't it, that Castle Combe to most people means the village which has won prettiest village in the United Kingdom countless times, but just on the edge of it, there's that glorious racer.
Yeah. Absolutely brilliant. It's a great track, and it dates all the way back to 1950. And so next year is very, very special for Castle Combe. It's the 70th anniversary celebrations. And the Classic, which tends to be run in October, we've got numerous marked races this year. The peach of a race was the race for pre-war Fraser-Nashes, the Freddie Giles Memorial Trophy, and Freddie won the Vintage Sports Car Club Seaman Vintage Trophy back in 1976 with a fabulous car that was in the Cognac Special. But it was the Super Sports cars that dominated Patrick Blakeney Edwards, young Tom Waterfield and Eddie Williams as well. That was one of the races. But the race that had the most historic synergy was the Fiskar race. Fiskar Historic Intermark, as they call it, for 50 sports cars. And it was won by Jonathan Abecassis, who's grandson of George Abecassis of HWM fame. 64 years and 4 days before Saturday's event, George Abecassis won the Red X Trophy there in an HWM Jaguar, beating no less a driver than Louis Rosier, former Le Mans winner, at the wheel of a Ferrari 750 Monza. So that Jonathan Abecassis, who won this race in a fantastic drive with Austin Healey, he beat an AC Ace Bristol and a couple of Lotus Elites in a really, really tight humdinger of a battle. And it was very, very special, not only as his grandfather had won his only race there at Castle Combe in 1955, but also he was watched there by both his young sons at the same time at a race meeting, and it just was the icing on the cake for him.
Sounds like a lot of fun, and I wish I'd been there. But yes, it's certainly one on the already very crowded calendar for next year.
Well, they haven't decided exactly what to do with it, but it may double up to 2 days next year just to get a few more classes on board. But it tends to be great mark racing. You tend to see Jaguars, Aston Martins, Austin Healey's. There's always a great touring car race among them. Formula Junior is often there. We've had 500cc Formula 3, which takes us right back to the early days of racing there with the likes of Sir Stirling Moss. But Castle Combe, a great place to race, and I'm looking forward very much to that next season. Well, Paul, that just about wraps it up for this podcast on historicracingnews.com. My season not quite over yet, though, because on the 19th and 20th of this month, I've got the Historic Sports Car Club Championship Finals at Silverstone, taking us back to the beginning of our podcast. And then a couple of weeks later, it's off to Portugal for the Algarve Classic Festival. Always a wonderful event on a magnificent circuit. Hopefully the weather will be good and the seafood will be absolutely top too.